What's up, you sweaty nerds and greasy degenerates? So the free-to-play premium 5-star character Dr. Ratio is about to release in Honkai Star Rail. So let's make a build guide for the dude, shall we? Now stick with me, because this is a more complicated character than normal to be able to build around, but if you watch the whole video, I think you'll find a lot of information here that will be very valuable in your building process. Now let's go ahead and move forward and get into this thing. So real quick, I just wanted players to understand that Dr. Ratio is slightly more complicated than the average character, which is totally fine. But before we start diving into relics and other things like that, I wanted to go over some really important things so that people understand how to properly play Dr. Ratio, kind of like how he works, and how to play him like optimally, and how to properly build him, of course. So we'll be going into that first, but if you want to skip ahead to that other stuff, I will be putting timestamps in the video. So just skip ahead if you want to. Check the pinned comment and description below, or hover over the timeline. So let's jump in. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at some crit rate and crit damage stats for Dr. Ratio. This is a baseline Dr. Ratio. This is completely naked. This is his own personal stats alone. This will not include relics or any other effects such as other characters and stuff like that. This is a baseline Dr. Ratio so that every player can know what their baseline is, no matter what. Regardless of what your team compositions are, relic sets, etc. We'll move forward and add other effects on after we know his baseline. This is just his baseline. This will assume, full transparency, that you will have 6 stacks of his Ascension 2 active, because you need to debuff the enemies in order to activate this, and you need to debuff the enemies to activate his follow-up attack synergy. So you're going to probably have this active no matter what anyways, because that's what you're naturally going to want when you build your team compositions, is put debuffers around them so that his kit actually works. So it's easy to assume that you're going to be able to have that. So something else I want to point out is that I found this on on Pridewind.gg's site as well. Through their calculations, they were able to determine that roughly 70% of Dr. Ratio's damage potential comes from his follow-up attacks, meaning roughly 70% of his damage is often from his follow-up attack. So you're gonna definitely want to get his follow-ups working. So let's move forward. Each stack from his Ascension 2 gives 2.5% crit rate and 5% crit damage. You get a total of 15% crit rate from that, and 30% crit damage from that. Let's stick to the crit rate for just a second here. So Inert Soul Sado is a relic set, so I kind of lied. There is one relic set that we're going to be including in this, but what I meant by no relics is no like relic substats and other things like that. Inert Soul Sado is clearly the best in slot planar set you could put on him because it has follow-up synergy. So I'm going to naturally assume that every player is going to strive to try to put Inert Soul Sado on him. So my apologies for kind of making it seem like there's no relics here. There's technically this one. So let's move forward. You could use other planar sets. I will talk about that, but this is the one you're going to want to strive to be able to use. So sub traces, you're going to get 12% crit rate from his sub traces. You get 5% just from him existing. A newborn baby in this game has 5% crit rate. So you add these all together and you get 40% crit rate. Now let's move forward to crit damage with the understanding you know how this works now. So you get that 30% crit damage from his Ascension 2 when they're all active. You get 50% crit damage from a naked, completely naked Dr. Ratio. This will give you 80% crit damage. So without having to do pretty much anything, you get 40% crit rate and 80% crit damage. Inert Soul Sado does have a 50% crit rate requirement, but this is very clearly able to be built for, because you're gonna get 40% from just him walking around with practically no investment whatsoever. So you're going to easily be able to reach this 50% crit value, and we're going to try to get a lot more than that, by the way. You're going to try to get a lot more than this, but you can reach the crit values you need in order to at least have the character on day 1 working. And obviously with an already starting 80% crit damage, without even putting any actual relics toward the crit damage whatsoever, or other effects from other characters, you can already tell this guy is going to have some very, very solid crit value, and you want to build him for crit. If you're not building him for crit, you're not building him right. This is just simply a character that needs to be built for crit. Okay, your Dr. Ratio is not going to work properly otherwise. So let's move forward. All right, so let's talk about something really important with Dr. Ratio that not every single player is going to be thinking about. You need to get the debuffs on enemies in order to get his follow-up synergies started, but you don't have to wait until like turn 2 to be able to do this. You can do this on turn 1, and you can actually enter battle with debuffs on enemies as well by using characters' techniques, right? For example, Dr. Ratio has a technique of his own, which debuffs enemies. Let's read it. After he uses his technique, it lasts for 10 seconds. There's a 100% base chance to reduce each single enemy target's speed by 15% for 2 turns. Pretty solid. Gets a debuff on potentially all the enemies, right? And it lasts for 2 turns. And if you have 100% base chance, just be aware that doesn't guarantee it's going to land. So you might want to build like a little effect hit rate on your Dr. Ratio, but not much, because you don't want to get diminishing. You don't want to like lose out on crit. You don't want to lose that on attack. You don't want to lose that on speed. So just be aware of that you might be able to use other characters' techniques to be able to get you to where you want for a good start. You might not necessarily have to rely on Dr. Ratio, but just be aware of that. Like if you have like 125, 130 or so effect hit rate, that should be good enough to get you a really, really good chance against elite enemies. But it's really just the elite enemies that you'd be worried about, which is important because you've always faced elite enemies in Memory of Chaos, etc. It's very important to remember that elite enemies have very high resistances. So something to just be aware of. All right, so with the understanding that we want to debuff enemies and that there's a lot of enemies that can apply debuffs, and we also want to apply debuffs with our techniques before battle even starts, I'm going to show you guys some characters that actually work really well with Dr. Ratio. I'm not going to deep dive every character and every team composition. I'm going to make a separate video for that because it deserves a dedicated video. This is a complicated character, and this video is already getting long enough. So let's go ahead and look at Gwenaifen real quick, because not everybody's going to be expecting her to actually work really well. This is not necessarily his best pairing, but it actually works really well. Gwenaifen has a talent that has a 100% base chance to apply Fire Kiss to enemies, which is a debuff, and it can apply a stack of it every time they take a burn status. So you can apply several different debuffs with Gwenaifen on the same character, or on the same enemy, and this will last for 3 turns, and it can stack up to 3 times. She also has a technique that can apply Fire Kiss technically, because what this technique will do is when it damages the enemy, it has the chance to inflict them with burn. And then when the turn starts, they might actually end up taking damage from it, and you can potentially apply 2 debuffs at the same time with 1 technique off of Gwenaifen. Let me see if I can show that to you guys right now. Let's go ahead and move forward. Technique. There he is. Boom. Let's see what happens here. See if I get lucky. Looks like we probably did there. Yeah, we got Fire Kiss on the enemy, which is not removable by the enemy. They can't, remove it themselves, and we can get more stacks of this. It lasts for 3 turns, which is incredibly valuable for Dr. Ratio. He also has the burn effect, this dude, and it lasts for 2 turns. And so you see here we have 2 debuffs. Just 1 character applied 2 debuffs. He only needs 3 for his follow-ups to actually work with 100% chance. Now you're going to want 6 different debuffs on enemies in order to get all of his crit rate and all of his crit damage out of him. But if you can get 2 debuffs on the enemies with 1 single character before battle even starts, you can already tell it should be pretty easy to apply 6 debuffs to the enemies if 1 character is able to do it before battle has even begun. So definitely something to consider. Now you might notice that not every single enemy has 2 debuffs, but you do have the debuff on 1 of the enemies at least. Fire Kiss did take effect on at least 1 of the enemies, so that's all Gucci. Let's move on to some other characters. Okay, so some people have asked me about Welt, because Welt is a character people want to pair with Dr. Ratio often because he can imprison enemies, but he also can debuff enemies as well, and he's going to crack off with a Dr. Ratio. His technique, for example, again, something we can apply to the enemies before combat even begins, can imprison enemies and have their actions delayed by 20%. So he can slow them along with Dr. Ratio, who can also slow them. You also have a chance to imprison enemies with his skill. You get the picture. Dr. Ratio and Welt are going to be pretty good buddies. They're going to like hanging out with each other. You don't need me to tell you that, though. He's a really great pairing. Also, don't forget, of course, Topaz is a really great pairing for Dr. Ratio, but that's a given. Everybody knows about that. You don't need me to tell you about that. A lot of people are going to be using Pela because she's a free-to-play option to use, but Pela also has a technique. Again, something you can use before battle even begins to potentially lower the defense of the enemies, which is a debuff. She also can potentially keep a permanent uptime with her ultimate if you have a well-built Pela, which is incredibly valuable because you basically have, if you have her well-built, you basically have a static debuff on enemies, and you don't have to worry too much about your debuffs falling off because she can pretty much keep them there all of the time. So definitely a character that is very valuable for a Dr. Ratio team. All right, now let's talk about the one, okay? Silverwolf. This chick has the juice, okay? Whenever you hear me say that, that's something good. That's something nice and shiny. That's like a diamond, okay? Silverwolf has the juice, okay? She's got a technique that can potentially apply quantum entanglement to the enemy. This would be considered a debuff, and it's something that you can apply before combat even begins. She has a skill that can debuff enemies, etc., etc., etc. Look at this damn paragraph. She can apply more than one debuff through this because she does have a talent, for example, that has 3 different debuffs that could potentially be applied to enemies. This chick is a debuffing queen, bro. She has an ult that can also debuff the enemies. So she's cracked and easily the best pairing for Dr. Ratio based on the debuffing that she can potentially apply. Obviously, Topaz is an incredible pairing. The damage output that those two together, like Topaz and Dr. Ratio, the damage output that they could put together is incredibly valuable. But I want you guys to understand, the best synergy to make Dr. Ratio's kit work the best actually comes from Silverwolf. Topaz has synergy that works really well with Dr. Ratio that make them both work really well, but Silverwolf hyper-focuses on Dr. Ratio performing very well. So something to consider. If you never picked up a Topaz, but you've got a Silverwolf, you're good, buddy, because you have arguably the best character for Dr. Ratio because she guarantees that his kit is going to work to its fullest potential. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at some speed stats really quick before we move on to relics and other things like that. Now, real quick, I need to point this out. This is very important. A lot of players will often try to reach 134 speed or higher with their character because that's the first breakpoint we get for extra actions in combats, the first threshold we get. But you do not need 134 plus speed or higher on Dr. Ratio at all. The hunt path meta has changed. He is a follow-up type character. He does not need the extra speed to act outside of his turn. He's able to act outside of his own turn and deal damage that way. And that's where most of his damage will be coming from. So you do not need 134 speed. Reaching 134 speed is something only the tryhards are going to want to do. And because I said that, all the tryhards are going to try to do this anyway, including myself probably. So let's go ahead and take a look at this just in case we want to go for it. He has a base stat of 103. If you're running Hackerspace or Musketeer, you'll get plus 6% speed to your stat. And again, I would not recommend using the bonus stat from Musketeer. That's not the set you're going to want to use on him, but you could run 2-piece Hackerspace and maybe the follow-up set or something like that as a potential option. I'm not saying it's the best option. I'm saying if you're trying to reach that 134 speed threshold, it's one of the ways that you can get there. So with the 6-speed bonus, you would only need 127 speed to get yourself to 134 speed or higher. This is often a lot of players' goals when building a character is at least 127 with a Hackerspace because it could get you to 134 or higher. So you would only need 24 substats and speed in order to get you to 127. The 127 plus the Hackerspace would get you to 134 plus. So again, 24 in substats would get you there without you needing to run a speed boot. But let's just say you had amazing substats. You got like 1,000,000 crit damage, 1,000,000 crit rate, and you just don't get any speed substats. And you're like, Pancake, what do I do? Well, one single speed boot would get you 25 speed. You take that, you add that to the 103. That gets you to 28. That gets you, with the 6% bonus, to 135.68 speed. That gets you there with just one speed boot. So you'd only need one speed boot and Hackerspace, and you'd get there. So that's pretty cool. That number of 103 is kind of nice, because one speed boot would get you there with Hackerspace or Musketeer, or you can also use 24 speeds on your substats. That would be all you needed with Hackerspace or Musketeer active. Now, You might not want to use these because they're not necessarily the most optimal relic sets to be able to use for him. So please let this be the most important thing you take from this. You do not need 134 speed or higher for your doctor ratio. You just don't. Okay? So just keep that in mind, please. All right, now let's move forward. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some light cones. I apologize for if this video looks out of order for whatever reason. I accidentally deleted a bunch of the footage I was going to use, so I'm having to re-record, so I apologize for that. I have a separate video going over the light cones in way more detail than I'm about to go into. We're just going to mostly cover some good ones and stuff like that. So go check the pinned comment and description below for that video if you haven't checked that out already. Obviously, Dr. Ratio's best in slot light cone will be his signature light cone, which is on screen right now. This is what his signature will do. It gives you really good crit damage. It gives you even more crit damage if you reach the debuffing requirement, which you will be able to do. When using their ultimate, to attack the enemy, the wearer receives the Disputation effect, which increases damage dealt by 36% and enables their follow-up attacks to ignore 24% of the target's defense. So he gets defense shred, extra damage. This effect only lasts for 2 turns, but who cares? This is such a powerful effect, and he's going to get so much energy back from his follow-ups from his talent that he's going to be able to ult really often and keep this active a very significant amount of the time. So definitely easily his best in slot light cone. Right after that is going to be Worrisome Blissful. This is Topaz Light Cone. I totally joked around and I was like, if you have Topaz, you're probably not going to be running this cone on Dr. Ratio because you're probably going to run it on Topaz. And then literally one human being on the entire Earth called me out and was like, hi, I'm the one guy on planet Earth that has Topaz's light cone and not Topaz. Obviously, I was just kidding. This is still going to be a very good cone. So just keep it in mind if you have this cone and you want to run it on your Dr. Ratio, regardless of whether you're using Topaz or not. This is still, at the end of the day, one of his best cones. Now, the one that comes afterwards, in my opinion, is Cruising in the Stellar Sea. This is the one that most players are going to be using because it is the most accessible to players, and it's the most easy to get to Superimposition 5, and literally new players can even get this cone, and it's also the cone that was used in the calculations that were on Pridewind's original calculations here that stirred up a whole bunch of like drama, and also not drama, but it stirred up a bunch of buzz, and it even impressed a lot of people, including myself. These numbers are really, really good, and this was the light cone used in the simulations that provided us those numbers. So keep this in mind. It's very clear that the setup you see right here will perform well, so definitely keep that in mind. We have proof that the cone works well. And this is probably what I'm going to use because I'm not going to be pulling his signature because I just can't. I have to save up for other characters. So I'm going to use this. If you guys wanted to know how much value I think this has, it's going to be pretty damn good. Let's take a look at what we already know about the cone. We'll have 40% crit rate because of the crit rate stats we have from his own personal stats. And we'll get 16% crit rate from this cone, giving us 56% crit rate. That's already a substantial amount of crit rate, and we haven't even factored in substats at all, or stats from other characters and synergies, etc. This is massive, guys. This means that if you only had a hypothetical 10% crit rate from your substats, which is abysmal, you can do much better than that, you'd hypothetically get 66% crit rate on the character, which is not ideal, but this is still a very well-functioning Dr. Ratio that will crit most of the time. You're going to want to reach a higher number than this. This is just a hypothetical low bar number to prove to you guys you can have a well-functioning Dr. Ratio that crits. So after this, you can, of course, focus in on a crit damage body, etc., etc. This allows us to make our build much more easily, having the right crit values that we want. So, Cruising in the Stellar Sea, very good cone. Most players will be using that. Only Silence Remains probably is going to be right behind that, in my opinion. It's going to be either Silence Remains or maybe Sword Play, because it depends on the situation whether one will be better than the other. Sword Play is a little bit more niche, but it is a very good cone if you're like trying to do a boss kill scenario. If you need to clear waves, this is not the best cone for him to use because it will only activate every time he deals damage to the enemy, and he does get to deal extra actions through his follow-ups. So this is actually going to be a really good cone. this is a sleeper cone, I think, for some people. This is a good cone. I've never said anything bad about the cone for Dr. Ratio, but it is not going to work in every scenario as well as some of the other cones we have with static abilities you don't have to build into. So keep that in mind. Only Silence Remains is also pretty good, but the better version of Only Silence Remains that has the flipped stats is Cruising in the Stellar Sea, which is, in my opinion, the more consistent, better one. But Only Silence Remains is still good if you have it at S5. Just keep that in mind. Now, I'm not really going to mention any of the others. We have Rivers of Blood here, which is not good. We have Return to Fartness, which is not going to be good for him either. If you have them, you can use them, but those should be stepping stones for a better cone for you in the future. I forgot to mention Sleep Like the Dead in my light cone video. My apologies for that. I didn't mean to skip it. It was an accident. This is a good cone for the crit damage. The second half is not all that great, but if you happen to have this and some decent crit rate substats, this can give you some really good crit value. So definitely keep Sleep Like the Dead in mind. In my opinion, it won't be as valuable as maybe some of the other cones, but this is definitely still a good cone. Way better than Rivers of Blood and Return to Fartness. Anyways, let's move forward. So obviously several different relic sets come to mind when you are considering running your Dr. Ratio. Of course, one of the first ones that comes to mind is the Imaginary set. He's an imaginary character. Of course, it's going to work well on him. Another set that comes to mind is the Ash Blazing Grand Duke set. He's a follow-up character. Of course, it's going to work well on him. And then another one that people are talking to me about is the Hackerspace set, because you can run the two-piece Hackerspace and the two-piece Grand Duke and actually perform really, really darn well. An example of this that we already have is actually from the damage calcs that Pridewind did originally. By the way, I don't know if you guys saw the videos that were, including my own, that covered this initially when this first came out. They've actually adjusted this since then, so come take a look at this for yourself if you are interested in this. Again, pin comment and description below. But the Messenger Hackerspace and Ash Blazing Grand Duke, along with Inert Soul Sato and Cruising in the Stellar Sea, this is what was used to make these calculations. And these calculations impressed a lot of people, including myself. And so I just wanted to point out, we have proof that this will actually work really well on Dr. Ratio. And just for heads up, I'll show you guys the rest of what they used. They used a crit damage body. That's what we're going to want to use as well, as a crit damage body. They used the speed boot to go along with the Hackerspace. We already showed you the calculations of how that works out. There, Dr. Ratio had over 134 speed in order to do this damage that you see before you. So consider that's actually a pretty good option. And the attack rope was also used, and an imaginary sphere was also used. They ended up having substats of crit rate 26.2. That's probably not even needed. And they had 70% crit damage on top of everything that they already had from his base stats. So just something to consider there. The Ash Blazing Grand Duke and the Hackerspace do work well with each other. And this, I want to talk about the imaginary set, but let me first just talk about the four-piece set here with the Grand Duke. When the wearer uses their follow-up attacks, it increases the wearer's attack by 6% for every time the follow-up attack deals damage. That sounds great. This effect can stack up to 8 times and last for 3 turns. Oh, that sounds great too. This effect is removed the next time the wearer uses a follow-up attack. That sounds like shit. We don't want that, right? So that's one problem why the Grand Duke set doesn't work super duper well on him, because he wants to do a bunch of different follow-up attacks outside of his turn without having his good effects fall off. So this doesn't necessarily work as well on him as it might with some of the other follow-up characters. So just wanted you guys to keep that in mind. This is still a good option. It's just you might want to consider the two-piece of this and potentially the two-piece Hackerspace. Depending on your stats and your build and your team compositions, maybe one will be better for you than the other. Just consider it. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on how this works. I'm not the biggest follow-up, player right now. I will be playing Dr. Ratio when he comes out, so I'll know more about it. I'm not perfect. I sometimes make mistakes. But let's take a look at this imaginary set here. Of course, the two-piece gives us 10% imaginary damage. And when attacking debuffed enemies, the wearer's crit rate increases by 10%, and the crit damage increases by 20% against imprisoned enemies. At first, I looked at this and I was like, is this actually that good? But then I realized this is actually going to be pretty darn solid on Dr. Ratio. This crit rate you get, I believe, will be static because it only says the crit damage is affected by the imprisoned enemy's part there. But we don't necessarily need the crit rate, right? We've already determined that we're going to get plenty of crit rate from our substats and from light cones and other stuff like that. So let's go ahead and take a look at something with Dr. Ratio that might, surprise you guys a little bit. So let's look at his profile. He gets 20 energy from his basic, 30 from his skill, 5 from his ult, and 5 from his talent triggers. So his talent is going to trigger a bunch of times. This will get him to his ultimate faster, even though it's a 140 energy cost. He's going to get a lot of triggers of his talent. So he's going to more than make up for that. So he's going to be able to use his ult very often, which means he's going to continue the follow-up synergies through his ult. So he's going to be able to deal a ton of damage. And he's going to be able to break enemy weakness, and he's going to be able to imprison enemies by breaking their weaknesses. That's how you get the imprisonment effect. So Dr. Ratio is going to be able to imprison enemies without you having to use anybody else at all. You don't have to have Welt on your team. You don't have to have Yukong on your team. He should be able to do this on his own. So you can run the 4-piece imaginary set, and I actually think it's going to be really, really damn good because that extra 20% crit damage is going to be nutty on this guy, okay? Because we can build this guy for super duper high crit damage because we're getting so much out of our crit substats, out of our crit, not crit substats, out of our base stats. We're going to probably potentially be able to get them on our light cone, depending on what light cone we use. He's going to be able to pop off with crit. This is a crit-based character. The more crit damage and crit rate you give them, the better they will usually do. So very, very much consider the imaginary set for him. It's going to work very, very well. And also you can consider the Ash Blazing Grand Duke or the combo of Ash Blazing Grand Duke and Messenger. Oh, and just in case this wasn't obvious because I didn't mention it, you can run the 2-piece imaginary set as well as the 2-piece from the Grand Duke set and combine those 2 sets together. That's probably what I'm going to do a lot of the time, to be honest with you. It's going to be a very, very good option because you don't have to have 134 speed on your Dr. Ratio like I was mentioning before. And something else that's very important to remember is that this imaginary set works really, really well, but it mostly works really, really well against imaginary weak enemies. This will not work as well as I was just describing if the enemies aren't imaginary weak, because then you won't be able to imprison them unless you have like somebody like Welt or something like that, right? So just keep that in mind, that if you aren't going to be going up against imaginary weak enemies, this set will not quite perform as well as we were just talking about. Combine maybe the set with something else. You get the point. Mix and match where it feels the best. You have different relics than everybody else. You're going to have to do what's best for your account. Every account is different and gets different substat drops from their farms. So let's move forward. All right, so Planar Ornaments. Okay, Inert Solsado. This is the granddaddy of them all. This is what's got the juice. This is the juice right here, okay? This is what we need. It increases the wearer's crit rate by 8%. When the wearer's crit rate reaches 50% or higher, the wearer's ultimate and follow-up attack damage increases by 15%. The ultimate is going to be cracking off pretty often because we're going to get energy back from our talents. So we're going to be ulting more often, and we're going to be doing follow-ups regularly because that's what he does. That's how he puts food on the table for his family. That's his bread and butter. That's his meat and potatoes. That's the whole kit and caboodle. That's what he does. He lives and breathes it. He's a follow-up attack character. Don't think about it too hard. Use the follow-up set on the follow-up character. So, Firmament's also a good option as well. I need to make a video about this set specifically, or the new sets and how they work on new characters, because this is newer and it is really good. It increases the wearer's attack by 12%. When the wearer's speed is equal to or higher than 135 or 160, the wearer deals 12% or 18% more damage. A damage multiplier like this is better, for example, than an attack multiplier like this. This is basically, this Glamoths, this is what power crept Space Ceiling Station, for example. Even DOT characters benefit from Glamoth now over Space Ceiling Station. Space Ceiling Station, unfortunately, has hit the bench, and Firmament is basically the new set you should use instead of it if you were ever in that type of scenario. So just keep that in mind. Very good set. Rudolent Arena, let's talk about this really quick, does give you crit value, but basic attack and skill damage is not what we want out of Dr. Ratio. He's not going to be using his skill nearly as much as he's going to be doing follow-up attacks. So Solsato blows Rudolent Arena out of the water. It's not even close. Follow-up synergy will definitely work better in this case, so stick to probably Solsato or Firmament in my personal opinion. All right, now let's talk about some main stats. So for the boots for Dr. Ratio, I highly recommend using attack boots if you can get away with it, if you're okay with not having this ultra high amount of speed on the character. That's what I'm probably going to be trying at first, and then I'll consider moving on to speed after that. So you can run speed boots or you can run attack boots on your Dr. Ratio. Obviously, if you're going to end up running the 2-piece Acrospace on your character, you're probably going to end up wanting the speed boots. Unless you have really good substats, then you won't necessarily have to. That's really up to you. So you have options there. For the body, you need to run a crit body. You need to run a crit damage body, okay? Run a crit damage body. Get enough crit from substats and from everything else. Run a crit damage body. I don't want to hear it. Don't be running anything else other than a crit damage body. That's what you need to do. Now, for the planar set, you're going to want to run an attack planar set, obviously, for this particular link rope. And for the sphere, you're going to want to run imaginary. You could run attack, but that's mostly a placeholder for you to be able to get an imaginary piece on your character. So main stats, pretty easy. Now, some of this should go without saying, but for the substats, you're going to want to run crit damage very highly. You're going to also want potentially crit rate, so you can make sure you get your crits. Don't forget, if you don't crit, your crit damage don't matter. Obviously, attack percent is a very valuable stat. Speed is an important stat if you need to go for that. And you might want to run some effect hit rate to make sure that his technique lands. But if you have other characters that can guarantee you a really good first turn, the effect hit rate might not matter to you as much. And then you might want to run something like break effect, or maybe even something that makes your character more tanky, like HP or defense. So just consider that that last slot is somewhat of a flex if you're not going to run effect hit rate. All right, now go out there and build yourselves an amazing free-to-play premium 5-star character, Dr. Ratio, which just so happens to be one of the best characters in the game. So I wish you the best of luck on your relic drops. I wish you the best of luck if you're pulling for his light cone. I'll see you in the next one. I'll do a follow-up video for team synergies and other stuff like that. There's plenty of more Dr. Ratio content to come. So I wish you the best of luck, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.